we all are already pointing out at least some forms of normativity in language, right? We're already trying to point out, well, that's not something you'd write in an academic text. Well, why? When you start to peel back the layer of gender, all of a sudden you get formality, and you get braciolinguistics, and you get cryptlinguistics, and you start to see that, oh, everything is at stake in how we language.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language,
Kris Knisely expands on his recent talk about gender justice in language education.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. We are excited to speak with Kris Knisely today. Dr. Knisely is Associate Professor of French and Intercultural Competence at the University of Arizona.
We will follow up on his recent talk as part of our monthly LRC speaker series titled Doing It Gender Justice, Reimagining Language Education Through Trans Knowledges.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Kris.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kris, before we dig into gender justice in language education, would you please tell us about your background and your path with languages?
Sure. It's a funny story that I like to tell my students often because it starts by me not wanting to take a language class. Picture this, I'm in 6th grade and we move. It's the middle of the school year. Bad news. I now have to take a language in my new district. Well, I asked to take Japanese, right? Because that sounds interesting to me. I'm a middle school kid. Anime sounds fun, right?
Yep.
That's about what I got for references. Cool. No, there's no room in Japanese. Well, can I take German? German sounds fun. I have friends who are German.
Sehr gut.
That would be great. No, there's no room in German for you. We have a spot for you in French. Well, can I take Spanish? No. Can I do the special program where I go to another school and I take Latin? No, there's a room for you in French. We have a space for you in French. I don't want to take French. Please let me take anything else. And there starts my dissertation. Trying to learn about how people think about language and what motivates them to start learning language, because I wanted anything but to do it. I find myself in college, there's a language requirement again. Well, I'm knee-deep in French. I guess I'm going to keep going. Now I'm about to graduate because I'm running out of money to pay for my school. And, well, I have enough credits in French, so I guess I'm getting a degree in French now. I don't really language that well in French. What am I going to do for a job? Time for me to go see the chair of the department and ask her for some advice, because I have no idea what I'm supposed to do with this. She says, well, if you want to stay, I'll help you get a job on campus that'll cover your master's. So now I'm getting a master's in French. I teach my first class and I go, teaching is awesome. This is what I want to do. And now here I am, a couple of PhDs and many, many moons later, far more than knee deep, but neck deep or further into this whole thing. So that's my story, with peppering in a couple of German classes that I once took.
I like it.
Just don't ask me to do anything in German, okay?
You got it.
Maybe I'd survive, maybe I wouldn't.
You would.
Early in your talk, you said, the stakes of this work are high because they're human. They're about who is and who is not here in our classrooms. And I think that's a great way for us to get started now. Tell us about the work that you do and how gender-just language practice benefits our classrooms and our communities.
That is a big question and a good question. I feel like I have to start with the caveat that everything I say today in this podcast is my personal and professional opinions. They do not reflect the views of the University of Arizona, the Arizona Board of Regents, any government or employing entity. And I say that because the work that I do is about pushing back against what I call cislingualism, which is these ideas that we have about language and these ideas that we have about gender that are really quite rigid and try to constrain. And to counter that, gender justice is about engaging with lingual cultures, so cultures of language that are about expansiveness and limitless possibilities, including trans cultures of language. When I talk about the work being about human stakes, it all starts with the fact that language can't be separated from the people who do language, right? It's an action that exists because we're doing it. When we're discussing language, we're discussing people, not some sort of abstract thing, right? And so, in following with that, when we start to criticize language, we're criticizing people. If we start to say things that are about clinging fast to binarist language, right? Like there's masculine, feminine, and nothing else shall exist. We're attempting to reinforce gender binarism and suggest that no one can be anything other than these highly restrictive categories, right? So we're saying things like if yel or ege or they doesn't exist, we're trying to say that people who self-reference with those terms don't exist.
Yeah.
And that's sort of where the humanness of all this comes. As far as why is it good for us in our classrooms, I mean, the quick and top of the sort of order of business is it's the ethical choice, right? Because gender just language is good for everyone. It makes space for everyone, especially people who are minoritized in terms of gender. And like, I should be able to stop there and great podcast. Have a nice day. Everyone go do gender justice. Right. But we all know that's also not how it works.
Yes.
Why not go over the other stuff, right? Because after we get through realizing that it's the only ethical choice, it's the choice that allows us to have a more robust and more meaningful relationship with language and what it is as this social and relational act. Well, then we start to measure down and see, well, what about traditional measures, right? A lot of language educators are concerned with competence, right? What do we end up being able to do with language? And I can take a lot of issue with the very notion of competence, but let's pretend like I love it just as much as everyone. And when we measure students' language production who have been taught in a gender just framework, they make fewer grammatical errors with equal levels of complexity. And they even have a tendency to do better on forms and structures that are traditionally acquired very late or notoriously hard to master, right? Things like noun class agreement in the case of the French languagers that I work with. Why? Because suddenly form and meaning matter to them, or such is my hypothesis. They start to pay attention because they too realize that the way that I express things influences how they're received and influences the relationships that I have with other people. So we get that. We get better measures on symbolic competence. We get better measures on intercultural competence. You name it. When we bring in gender justice, we're not placing this in competition with our learning goals, objectives, and outcomes. To the contrary, justice work fuels these better outcomes. So let's do it. Great. End of podcast. Okay. No, I'm just kidding.
We're going to talk about coffee some more now.
Yeah, right?
Perfect. Back to coffee.
So, Kris, you just mentioned a gender just framework and bringing in gender justice. What does that actually mean? What does that look like in a language classroom? Can you give us some specific examples, like some strategies? How does this translate into the classroom?
Totally. So like, I think the first thing that tends to spring to people's minds is, okay, gender justice means that I have to add pronouns. I
Mm-hmm.
have to add whatever structures would make it possible for non-binary people and people who are gender non-conforming to do language in self-congruent ways. And that's like an extremely important first step. But without a gender just frame, that ends up sort of taking binaries and turning them into trinaries and like good in the sense that that makes life more livable for some people, language more roomy for some people. But it's not all of the work because we're still maintaining the power to oppress and marginalize. We're just
Right.
distributing it over
Mm-hmm.
more categories, right? So we're back to that very cislingual thinking of, well, how many categories are enough? How many forms are enough? And the thing with gender justice is to say, well, that's not really the question, right? That question might matter, but the core of what we're doing is what is language and what relationship to language am I teaching? So, some of the things that a gender just framework is really about is thinking with trans knowledges and doing that by teaching students to always be critically paying attention to the roles of language, assumptions, and normativities in sort of establishing these hierarchies of power that shape our realities, right? Thinking about what are these circulating ideas about what's good, desirable, or permissible versus what's bad, impossible, or unacceptable, right? So they're learning this sort of what Cynthia Nelson named restive problematizing, which I really quite like. This constant,
Mm-hmm.
what is the status quo? Why is it the way that it is? Who benefits? Who's marginalized? What alternative exists? And how is language involved? And then also teaching them that they get to answer those questions. They get to take stake in how they position themselves in the power game, right?
Right.
They're not just these passive users of language that's being foisted upon them. Whatever version is in the textbook, there you go. That is
Mm-hmm.
language. You must do it.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching them that the textbook is made by people and by publishers who have stake in making sure that it's widely sold, recognized as approaching these ideas of what standard might be or what powerful language is. But they don't have to necessarily reproduce that. And many people who language in the varieties that they're learning, well, they don't necessarily speak and write and sign and
Mm-hmm.
communicate like the textbook either.
Right.
So understanding that everything is sort of up for grabs and they're agentive languagers. Just because they're learners doesn't mean they're not languagers. Just because this isn't their first or primary language necessarily doesn't mean that they're not part of the languaging community. And so really understanding how power functions and really getting a chance to think about where do they want to push back? Where does that maybe not serve them? And thinking about that game. And then maybe some of the more evident or dialed in parts of gender just teaching is regularly engaging with locally relevant real world queer and trans knowledges, experiences, and ways of languaging. So bringing in those forms, bringing in discursive moves, bringing
Mm-hmm.
in how language gets taken up and shaped in cultural contexts, having along with that, this respect for individual agency, a right to self definition, and understanding that we have disparate worldviews and we have to engage respectfully across them. And also teaching them that, like, fluidity, flexibility, and complexity are necessary for approaching anything that's human and definitely for approaching language. It's not going to be neat and easy. We can grit it out. We can sort of mechanically learn certain patterns and structures. But that's practice that fits inside a much messier reality, right? Or set of realities, really. So that's kind of the big ways
Yeah.
of thinking about
Yeah.
what gender just pedagogies are. How they get taken up are like a million possible answers, because that's kind of the key to queer and
Sure.
trans
Yeah.
thinking is there isn't one way. It
Mm-hmm.
has to be negotiated in context with the people who are there. But those are the big threads that we have to follow as we start to think about what might work in my context with my
Yeah.
students and collaborators.
So that seems like a good jumping off point to zoom in a little bit and talk about the trans affirming queer inquiry based pedagogies, or TAQIBPs. You talked about those when you gave your lecture recently. What are the principles of these pedagogies? What can you tell us about them? How can an instructor make use of them?
Yeah, I love that you're asking about that, because I didn't name it as that, but that's totally what I'm describing, right?
Yeah.
When I describe this big idea of understanding language as a verb, and teaching students to have this more fluid and flexible relationship to it. So, like, if we had to hit the big picture, the broad strokes of TAQIBPs, it's about teaching a critical form of literacy, right? And one that engages queer and trans knowledges. And with that, it's about interrogating and exposing normativity in all of its forms. We think about gender justice as being like, okay, we're going to lay bare where there are norms associated with gender. Cool. Yes, and, right? Because justice work, it means that we're always connected to all ways that we're positioned in the world. Like, when I talk about my masculinity, I don't stop being white. I don't stop being
Right.
middle class,
Right.
all of those things, right? So if we're teaching students to pick up on norms, we have to teach them to sort of look for all of them. And those are those questions with restive problematizing that I was talking about. And then respectful engagement that I was talking about. But I guess some of the big strategies that might be different from what I've already said is first exploring with and alongside students. That's part of decentering power in the classroom and individualizing learning. And it's really part of taking a queer and trans approach to expertise, helping students step into what they know and what they bring. And okay, it's really hard to like take ourselves out of powerful positions as
Sure.
educators in a format where eventually we have to mark something in the final roster for the registrar, right? There's power there, but acknowledging it and doing whatever we can to sort of trouble that is a huge part of TAQIBPs. It's also about finding space throughout the curriculum, right? We don't want trans day or trans week or
Right.
trans class, right?
Right.
We don't want to have this just get shown up in one little unit that really sort of literally remarginalizes it, right? Like in the side of our textbook, or one page 197,
Right.
everything trans. Or even like we have a tendency for this to get put on one instructor who feels particularly compelled to take it up or particularly well equipped to take it up. Or one class, like a conversation class, where we're like, yes, we can definitely talk about this there. It's a contemporary, I'm using big air quotes, issue,
Yeah.
right? What it's about is recognizing that queer and trans thinking is really central to everything we have in terms of language learning goals and objectives, right? Like, our whole purpose in language education is tied right up with trans thinking about language, right? That people should be able to do language in a way that feels good to them and helps them connect with other people and helps them convey their worlds and understand other people's worlds, right? Like, all of that relationality and thinking about power, we're talking about the big buzzwords of our field, right? We're talking about intercultural competence, symbolic competence, linguistic competence,
Absolutely.
all of these competencies that we're talking about. If we think with queer and trans knowledges, we get a really useful way into those. I get off and excited on my tangents as any good obsessive researcher does. So to bring it back to what our TIQIBP is, so in addition to that sort of lining up, what else are we doing when we're doing this? We're doing critical close reading and discussion, right? We're looking at text in the broadest sense of the word, right? Recordings, videos, written text, etc. And we're looking at how is language working? What are people doing with language? And how are the assumptions about language, about our worlds, about each other showing up in that text? And we're learning how normative discourses may render certain people and certain ways of languaging more valued and more apparent, and other ways of being, knowing, and languaging marginalized or entirely not represented, right? One big thing we hear a lot is, oh, well, X language only has this or this form, right? Spanish only has masculine or feminine. German only has these particular categories. Language doesn't have anything. Language isn't a thing, right? It's not capable of doing or not doing, possessing or not possessing certain forms, structures, expressing or not expressing certain ideas. No, people are doing this act of languaging, and we will make language work for us, right? We will take this and do this act in whatever way allows us to meet our shifting needs in terms of what we're expressing and the relationships we have. So that's part of what this critical close reading tries to help students observe, is that language isn't this thing that just exists before us or without us. People are doing stance taking, people are innovating, people are constantly changing language. That's not right. Like we hear a lot also about like how language change is something to be avoided or controlled, right? Like the Académie Française or the Real
Right.
Academia Española love to say that like we need to protect this specific version. What?
Yeah, why? Oh.
Who does that serve? And in what way has that ever aligned with everything we know about how language functions?
Yeah.
It doesn't. Top down language, like prescribing, almost never works, right? That's not what happens. So there's Kirby Conrad, who is an awesome linguist who works on pronouns in English, but they wrote this really great excerpt on their blog, on their Medium blog, where there is something to the extent of, I could take all my favorite pronoun linguists and sit us down in a room and try to engineer the best way to do non-binary language. And not only would we not have come to an agreement, also the level of like meddling and control that involves, like me and my very cool colleagues are unwilling to do that kind of linguistic fascism, if you'll permit me the phrase. So like we couldn't agree, and even if we did, that's not a great way to be. And even still, if we even put those two facts aside and we went out into the world and said, this is the way, that's not going to
Right.
make people change what they do.
Yeah.
So I guess that sort of brings us from tying queer and trans content to language learning goals all the way down to the big last one, which is this focus on respectful engagement. Jay Paez writes, we're not on an evangelizing mission of changing hearts and minds. We're working to move the needle of respect and understanding, right? And so I think a lot of times people can get nervous about what they understand as going full tilt, and just sort of creating a new prescription. But that's not what we're doing. We're trying to help people recognize that decisions about how we do language are made in the aggregate. Everyone is making their decisions, how they show up in language. And then as we're all doing language together, patterns emerge. And then we sort of react to those as we observe them, right? And either we shift towards or we position ourselves against each of those things. And it's this like little dance that we do, right? I love to like picture like these groups of fish like swimming together and then changing patterns and groupings and doing this like beautiful little social relational dance, and like
Yeah.
different forms show up, and it's not a big deal, right? Like a lot of times I want to take people who are very very tightly grabbing on to linguistic authority and trying to stake claim to it, and just sit them down and say, calm down. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
People are just going to do language and it's fine. Not that that would work for so many reasons, but I digress.
Oh boy.
So, Kris, thinking about our colleagues, language teaching colleagues, thinking about myself, if I teach first semester German, right? And I mean, let's not even discuss whether or not the structure and the curricula that currently exist are good or bad, right? But it is what it is, right? We teach in the structure that we teach in. So other than showing respect to my students, what else can I do in a elementary level language class to be mindful, to be gender just? Do you have specific suggestions for our listeners?
Yes, I do, and I'm glad you asked it. First of all, because you're teaching German, you're going to go and look at and please correct me if I do this in the most incorrect way possible. You're going to go look at Gnadenlos Deutsch. How did I do? Did I do all right?
Grenzenlos Deutsch? German without
That's the
borders?
one.
Sehr
That's the
schön,
one.
yep, sehr gut.
Yep, so you're going to go check that one out because that's a text that puts translanguaging alongside sort of more canonical forms and structures. And so if you're not teaching German, you're going to see if there's something out there. And if there's not, maybe that's when you get in the weeds with your students. One thing that I like to do when I was a lowly TA and I didn't have the power to choose my textbook, as a
Sure.
lot of people don't, I would make a corrected page, right? So I would take, maybe it's page 400, and I'd either ask students to slide a corrected page 400 in there that then put these novel forms
Yeah.
and structures right in there with the others. I just, I'd get a little whiteout, I'd get to work, it'd be a little handicraft there. And I'd either put a corrected one or I'd put like page 400B, slide that in your textbook. And sort of outside of class or in the ends of class, we'd use a little English and we'd talk about the shortcomings of the textbook.
Yep.
Because sometimes we need those translingual moments, particularly with earlier language learners, to explain what are we doing and why, so that they're not, because what are we doing in language class, really? For the student who takes German 101 and German 102 and then never touches German again for their entire life, there are things that they'll remember, right?
Sure. Yep.
And it might not always be languaging. Sometimes it's these metalinguistic discussions. So allowing a little room for that to happen. And so placing these little moments where we're bringing in novel forms and structures and questioning what's happening
Yeah.
in our texts and materials, That's like a first start. If you can go out and get a ready-made book that includes trans people, awesome. And also look me up on the internet and tell me what it is, because I'd love to know.
And we'll have Kris's contact information in the show notes. So
Love it. Thank you. Well, we will also put in the show notes. The other thing that you can do is I have on my website, krisknisely.com/resources for educators. I have a bunch of little infographics that you are welcome to print out and use with your students. They're free. They do things like explain how these ways of languaging work in French, because that's the language in which I am able to explain how these things work. But give me time. I'm working with friends to get some more resources up there in other languages.
Nice.
But they have there's that. But then there's also like infographics on how to sort of ethically and respectfully engage with communities other than one's own. And that can be useful for doing activities with students that involve data gathering. Like maybe you don't know what's happening in, I should pick a random language, Italian. Maybe you don't know what forms and structures to add in Italian. And you're like, I want to do this, but I have no training like most people on this, and I don't want to really mess it up. Well, what you probably do know how to do is gather language data, analyze language data. And it can be really powerful to invite your students to go out and gather data. It helps them create a more meaningful relationship with language, to get out there into the languaging communities that you're trying to sort of apprentice them into, if you will. And then it allows you to come back and ask questions of that with them. A very let's share in figuring this out together approach, where you sort of set the pedagogical tone, but everyone has equal stakes in figuring out what possibilities might be there. What could we do with language? And it allows them to jump into that language analysis and language manipulation and play. And so on that note, I have an open access chapter that'll be out any day now with the Center for Educational Resources in Language and Literature Circle at the University of Arizona, and that you'll have a free copy of on my website, krisknisely.com/IALLE. And what that does is it gives you exercises that you can do where you can plug in the data that you collect with your students. I have an example that's in French, data ready to go. But if not, I have very specific ideas about what do you then do with the data you collect? What kind of questions do you ask? So it's hopefully a semi-ready to go document that you could edit and then use to bring that activity in. And sort of with this, and in the spirit of TAQIBPs, that's an exercise that you can then do with all sorts of language variation, right? You can engage that in talking about register and formality and what we might understand to be slang, right? A concept that students tend to come into class fairly familiar with. And you can use that to talk about how language is racialized, how language is ableist, how language is all of these things. Or I shouldn't say language is. See, it's so easy to turn language into a thing, isn't it?
Right.
How we do ableism and racism and all of these things in and through language. It's a useful shorthand to treat language like a thing, but it obscures what's really happening in our linguistic lives, doesn't it?
Right.
So this sort of like, let's do data together. Let's edit the textbook. Let's notice all of the places where assumptions are being made by me, by you, by the textbook. And it's not with the idea that like, I want to trap you and then say, oh, see, you were very binarist right there. No, but it's teaching you to see that happens, that dare I say, nearly we all do it because we all live in a wildly cislingualist, binarist, cissexist world. And so in order to start being able to observe and step back from some of these assumptions that we make, we have to just be constantly watching for them and helping each other point it out. And some really interesting things will happen. Even in a 101 class, when you start introducing those things, you might find that your students have a lot of questions after class and people start showing up to your office hours. But I, I, I think there's a lot of use in thinking about how can I bring this constant monitoring of these assumptions we make about how gender and language go together. And then how can I use what I already know about how I might be bringing students' attention to other norms? Because we all are already, I hope, pointing out at least some forms of normativity in language, right? We're already trying to point out, well, that's not something you'd write in an academic text. Well, why? Right? And so it's when you start to peel back the layer of gender, all of a sudden you get formality and you get ratiolinguistics and you get cryptlinguistics and you start to see that, oh, everything is at stake in how we language, and all of that can be sort of taken up together. And I feel like I went way off the ledge because I was supposed to be giving you advice
all
on a
good.
101 and I just went right back to big picture.
All good. No, I think the resources you point our listeners to are amazing.
I think the message is start somewhere and then keep going.
Yep.
Right? Make sure that you're starting somewhere meaningful, like the value and validity and existence of trans people is not up for debate and cannot be made into a debate. So like that's like the careful line to walk. But as long as you're doing it with like, I want to bring value and attention to this, start somewhere and keep being open to feedback and growth. Like if we could sit down and rewrite an entire textbook over the weekend and be ready to go for class on Monday, well, don't you think we would have all done? I'd like to believe that enough people would have done that we'd have all that. It's a lot of work. And so don't let the sort of inertia hold you back from starting.
Yeah.
Because starting is better than nothing. And that's how we do all of the other things that we tend to notice and need to improve in our classrooms as we go, oh, well, yeah, I can add a little note here. I can add a little note there. I could add an activity here or swap this picture out with that picture there. And all of those things start to add up as you start to think in this frame and realize the little moments that you can do with the time and resources that you have. And, then year after year, suddenly you're getting somewhere. So that's my, wherever you are in your gender just journey, take it. That's
Nice. Yeah.
that's the perhaps corny, but very earnest.
Yeah.
Go, do it, try.
Fantastic. Well, you talked quite a bit there about noticing your students' response to this pedagogy. I know you recently published an article about student attitudes toward and experiences with translingual cultures in French. Anything else, any other findings you had there that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so that article in the International Journal of Bilingualism and Bilingual Education, I think the big takeaways for me of that study was confirming a bit what I already hypothesized. Our students are ready for this. They want this information. And then there are some students who are going to first experience this with a bit of hesitation and negativity because they too have been exposed to these circulating wildly transphobic discourses that are a bit on fire at the moment. But even those students who may have started this 16-week course saying, I don't know why we're talking about this, I just want to learn French, end the course way more often than not saying, I get it now. I get why this is relevant to me, and it has helped me think about language differently. And to me, that's huge. If you can affect someone's openness to the way that they might think in 16 weeks, I mean, my goodness.
Yeah.
And not in a sort of like, I'm out here marching for trans rights kind of way, but in a, it's helpful for me to understand the world around me, to be exposed to more perspectives and more ways of doing language. And it helps me think differently, even if whatever I might think at home. But I think some of that also comes to sort of go back to that Jay Paya's quote. I think some of that also comes back to this combination of, this isn't about your buy-in. This isn't about your opinion. Like, whether these ways of languaging exist is unrelated to your opinions. Like, sort of taking apart the notion that, like, they have to love it and are somehow, like, marching in a pride parade just to understand what these forms are doing and why. And, like, I'm of many minds on this, but let's not get into that bit. I think there's something powerful to teach people to be able to engage with people that are different from them.
Sure.
And people whose experiences might be wildly distinct from theirs. And so in that journal article, to see that students who wanted to learn about it only enjoyed it more after they experienced it and are like, yes, please keep going. And students who didn't think that it was relevant to them can then articulate the ways in which this is useful, including some students who were very opposed are going into medicine and then say, you know what, I've realized that I'll probably have trans patients and it doesn't cost me anything to just treat them as human beings.
Right.
Like, what a better world we'd live in if everyone could sort of move towards, you know what people do in their lives actually doesn't affect me, and I've come to realize that.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a perfect statement to end on here, right? Kris, I really appreciate the work that you do. It is so important, especially at this very moment in time that we find ourselves in this very country that we find ourselves in this very world that we find ourselves in. So keep doing what you're doing. But before we sign off, before we let you go, we would like to ask you for a word in a language that you love, that you're learning, that you want to learn, that makes you feel good. What is that word?
Oh, this is so silly, but I have always loved the word pamplemousse.
Yes, such a good one.
It just feels good in the mouth, doesn't it?
Très bien.
I love that you're ending on this question, because to bring it back to sort of the content of what we're talking about, it's a good reminder that we like to deride certain ways of doing language, but when language makes us feel good, when artists do it and musicians do it, we celebrate it. And so maybe we do better to recognize that people doing language that makes them feel good and doesn't hurt anybody else is a good thing for all of us, because we could all use a little bit more feeling good in the world.
Hear, hear.
Yeah. On that note, thank you so much for speaking of language with us, Kris.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Next week, we'll speak with Adriana Lima about Cornell's Latino Living Center.
Until then,
Auf Wiederhören.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
And follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.